The first time Susan saw Frank, she thought he was everything. Not just a man but the man. The reason her heart kept pushing through the heavy days. He had this quiet anger in his eyes. The kind that made people step back, but it only pulled her closer. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe it was fate twisting her neck toward trouble. But she loved him in a way that felt like it burned her from the inside out. Frank never loved easily. He held people at a distance, like they were fire and he'd been burned too many times to reach out again. But with Susan there were moments, small ones, where his eyes softened. Not much, just enough to give her hope. Hope that if she just gave him more, did more, maybe he'd finally let her in. She gave everything. She gave her time, her heart, her future. And eventually, when it came to it, she gave her legs. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was late autumn when Frank got into trouble with some dangerous men. Men like Raymond, cold, sharp, and always 5 steps ahead. Frank owed them, not money, but loyalty. He betrayed them, for her. He said it was for her. But deep down Susan always wondered if he did it for himself. If maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as noble as she wanted to believe. The night it happened, Susan could still feel the wind slicing through her coat. She remembered how the headlights from Raymond's car cut through the dark like 2 knives in the fog. Frank had been frantic, his hands trembling as he told her to run. But she didn't run. She never ran from him. Instead she shoved him out of the way just as the car roared toward them. Metal crushed bone before her mind could even scream. Pain ripped up her body so sharp, she swore it split the night in 2. And in that moment, as she lay bleeding on the cold pavement, she looked up at Frank, not in fear, not in regret, but in silent, desperate love. Frank didn't even cry. He stared at her with an expression so hollow, it gutted her more than the loss of her legs. Not fear, not sorrow, just disappointment. Like she had failed him somehow by saving his life. Like her sacrifice had become an inconvenience. Susan should have died that night. She wished she had. Instead she woke up in a hospital bed 2 weeks later. Tubes tangled in her arms. Machines beeping to keep her alive. Her legs were gone. Just gone. As if they had never belonged to her at all. Frank never came to see her. Not once. The nurses said he had called. Once, maybe twice. But she knew it was a lie to keep her from slipping into despair. And then Shirley, her only real friend left, told her the truth. Frank had vanished, packed his life into a suitcase and disappeared like she never existed. Like her blood hadn't soaked the pavement for him. For weeks Susan lay there, numb in a way that no morphine could touch. Shirley visited every day, brightening the room with forced smiles and silly stories. But Susan barely heard them. Her mind was filled with the last thing Frank had given her. Emptiness. She hated him. But more than that, she hated herself for still loving him. Raymond visited once. Only once. He stood at the foot of her bed, hands in his pockets, eyes dark as tar. He said something that stuck with her far longer than the pitying looks of the nurses, or the empty ache where her legs used to be. You wasted your life for a man who wouldn't cross the street for you, Susan. That sentence curled inside her like poison. Every day, it pulsed in her chest, feeding a new fire that began to grow under the ashes of her broken heart. And then something shifted. Something cold. Something sharp. Susan decided that if life had given her a second chance, it wasn't for begging. It wasn't for tears. It was for revenge. Not to hurt Frank. No, that would be too easy. She would hurt him in the way that would scar deeper than any bullet, any blade. She would make him believe she never existed at all. The first time Susan tried to sit up on her own, her body betrayed her. Her arms shook, her back screamed, and the stump of what used to be her legs burned with a phantom pain that felt worse than fire. She collapsed against the pillow, breathless, humiliated. The nurse rushed over, but Susan waved her off, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. "I'm fine," she lied, tasting bitterness on her tongue. Inside she wasn't fine. Inside she was a storm of fury and heartbreak so fierce it felt like it could rip the ceiling off the hospital. But no one could see that. She wouldn't let them. Shirley saw it though. Shirley always saw through the mask Susan tried to wear. "You have to let it out, Susan," Shirley said quietly one day, brushing tangled hair away from Susan's pale face. "You can't keep it all in." Susan's eyes stayed fixed on the window, on the slice of sky she could see between the buildings. She wondered if Frank was out there, somewhere, looking up at the same sky. Probably not. He was never the kind of man who looked up. He only ever looked forward, never back. I don't want to let it out, Susan whispered, her voice flat and sharp. I want it to stay. I want it to grow. Shirley hesitated. She had always been the softer one, the one who believed in second chances, in forgiving even when people didn't deserve it. But not this time. Not after what Frank did. Even Shirley couldn't defend him anymore. You deserved better, Shirley said, and her voice trembled, almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as Susan. Susan said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth sat between them like a dead weight. Weeks turned into months. Susan pushed herself harder than anyone thought she could. She forced her body to move, to adapt, to survive. She endured the agony of rehabilitation, the cruel stares of strangers when she was wheeled out of the hospital for the first time. But her pride, her burning, twisted pride, refused to let her crumble, and when the doctors fitted her for prosthetics, Susan looked at her reflection in the mirror, and barely recognized herself. Pale skin stretched tight over bone, shadows under her eyes like bruises from too many sleepless nights. But her gaze had sharpened into something cold and unbreakable. The woman in the mirror wasn't broken, she was reborn. Shirley drove her home from the rehab center, hands tight around the steering wheel, eyes flicking nervously to Susan every few seconds. You sure you want to do this alone? She asked. For the 10th time. Susan didn't answer. She didn't have to. The apartment she had shared with Frank felt like a graveyard. His scent was gone. His things were gone. But the ghosts remained. Memories clung to the walls like cobwebs. She could see him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with that smug smirk. She could hear him in the hallway, his footsteps heavy with frustration. She could even smell his cologne, like a phantom clawing at her throat. Susan locked the door behind her and stood there, breathing in the silence. And then, with deliberate care, she tore the place apart. Every photograph, every letter, every piece of him she had clung to like a fool. She burned them all. Flames licked at her past, turning love into ash. When the smoke curled up toward the ceiling, Susan felt something inside her loosen, like a chain finally breaking. Raymond found her 2 weeks later. She didn't ask how he knew where she was, but she wasn't surprised. Men like Raymond always knew. You're not the same girl I saw in that hospital bed, he said, eyeing her with a mix of curiosity and respect. I thought you'd give up. You thought wrong, Susan replied, her voice steady. Raymond smirked, but there was no warmth in it. Good, he said, because I have something you might want. She almost didn't listen. Almost. But then he dropped the name she had buried deep inside her mind. The name she had promised never to speak again. Frank. Her chest tightened like a fist closing around her heart. Raymond leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. He thinks you're dead. Susan didn't blink. Then let's keep it that way. But her mind was already racing, spinning with 100 plans, 1,000 dark possibilities. She didn't want him to see her. She wanted him to feel her absence like a knife in his gut, like a shadow he could never escape. Raymond studied her for a moment longer, then slid a folded piece of paper across the table. An address. A door she thought she had closed forever. He's not the same man either, Raymond warned, standing to leave. He's worse. Susan tucked the paper into her pocket without a word. Her eyes, sharp and cold, stayed fixed on the empty chair across from her. Good, she thought bitterly. So am I. The address Raymond had given her was in a part of the city Susan hadn't stepped foot in since her old life burned to the ground. It was the kind of place where shadows stretched long even at noon, where every corner seemed to whisper secrets you didn't want to hear. Susan stared at the slip of paper for a long time, turning it between her fingers, feeling its weight like it carried her whole past in its fibers. She should have thrown it away, should have torn it up, scattered it to the wind, and let Frank fade into the nothingness he deserved. But her hand disobeyed her mind, folding the paper neatly and sliding it into her coat pocket. That night she couldn't sleep. The ceiling above her bed felt too low, like it was pressing down on her chest. Memories kept flashing behind her closed eyelids. Frank's crooked smile, the way his voice could turn sharp in an instant, the empty space in his eyes when she had bled out on the street for him. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside her window, rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier, until it felt like the whole sky was weeping for her. She let it cry, all it wanted, because she had no more tears left to give. By morning Susan had made her choice. She dressed carefully, sliding her prosthetics on with a mechanical grace that had taken months of agony to master. Every movement reminded her of what she had lost, but it also reminded her of what she had survived. The woman in the mirror wasn't soft anymore. She wasn't waiting for love. She was carving her own path through the wreckage Frank had left behind. Shirley caught her at the door, face tight with worry. "You're not going after him, are you?" Susan's lips curled into something that might have once been a smile, but now felt more like a scar. "No," she said calmly, "I'm going past him." But Shirley wasn't convinced. She reached out, catching Susan's sleeve. "Don't let him steal any more of you," she pleaded. Susan looked at her, eyes cold and steady. "He doesn't get to steal anything anymore." The streets felt like a battlefield as she moved through them, every step powered by fury and determination. Her mind replayed the image of Frank over and over, like a film stuck on the worst frame. She wondered what he looked like now. Older, more bitter, or had he managed to crawl away from the consequences of his choices, as he always had? When she arrived at the address, it wasn't what she expected. It was worse. A rundown building, rust curling around the edges of the metal doors, windows smeared with grime. Frank had fallen, that much was clear. He wasn't the powerful, untouchable man she had once worshipped. He was something smaller now, something meaner and more desperate. "Good." Susan watched from across the street, hidden beneath the shadow of an old awning. She saw him come out around noon, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting like a man always expecting danger. His once proud stride had shriveled into a cautious shuffle. Even from a distance, she could see it. Frank was afraid of men like Raymond, afraid of debts unpaid, afraid of his own shadow. He hadn't seen her. He never would. Not the new her. Susan's fingers tightened around the crumpled photograph she'd kept in her pocket. Not of Frank but of herself. From before the accident. She tore it in half slowly, watching the pieces flutter to the wet pavement. Frank disappeared down the street, oblivious to the eyes tracking his every move. Susan turned away from the window, her pulse steady, her mind sharp. This wasn't about confronting him. No, she had crossed that bridge in her nightmares, too many times to count. This was about erasing him from her soul, like he had erased her from his life. She would watch him sink, silent and unseen, and she would build something greater from his ashes. She wasn't here to beg for answers, or for closure. She was here to bury the last piece of herself that still ached for him. As she walked away from the building, rain still dripping from the edges of her coat, she felt something inside her shift. Not forgiveness, not peace, something colder, stronger, freedom. But even as she told herself she was done, a small voice inside her whispered that it wasn't over. Not yet. Because Frank wasn't the only ghost from her past. And Raymond, he wasn't done with her either. Days passed, but Susan's mind stayed welded to the moment she saw Frank skulking out of that building. She could still see the way his eyes darted, like a man hunted by his own shadow. It should have satisfied her. It should have been enough to see him reduced to such a pitiful shell. But it wasn't. Not even close. Raymond had been right about one thing. Frank was worse now. But what Raymond didn't know was that Susan had become worse too. Worse in the way the world feared. Worse in the way that meant she wouldn't hesitate when the time came. She spent the next few days tracking him from a distance. Quiet. Invisible. Frank never noticed. He never looked back. The man who used to command attention had become a ghost in the crowd, and Susan followed his hollow footsteps like a shadow he couldn't shake. But shadows weren't the only company she kept. Raymond showed up again, unannounced, like he always did. He had this way of appearing, just when Susan thought she had found a moment of calm, as if he could smell her resolve tightening. "You're getting good at this," he remarked, sliding into the seat across from her at the corner cafe where she watched Frank's building. He didn't bother with greetings. Raymond never wasted time on pleasantries. Susan's eyes stayed on Frank's window across the street. "What do you want, Raymond?" "I want what you want," he said smoothly, lifting a cup of bitter coffee to his lips. To see him fall so hard, he'll never crawl back up. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was enough. Raymond leaned in, lowering his voice. "He owes me too, you know." Susan's jaw tightened. She already knew that. Frank had burned every bridge on his way down, and now the flames were catching up to him. "He'll pay," Susan said, her voice flat and certain. Raymond's lips curled at the edges, not quite a smile. "Then let me help you." The offer dangled between them like a razor blade. Susan didn't trust him. She would have been a fool too. But there was a grim kind of logic to it. Raymond had connections. She didn't. He could move in places she couldn't. And most importantly, he wanted Frank buried just as badly. Susan hesitated, only a moment before she gave a small sharp nod. "Good girl," Raymond murmured, as if she were a pawn falling neatly into place. But Susan was no one's pawn. The days that followed felt like a dark symphony, each note dragging her deeper into the storm. Raymond fed her information, where Frank slept, who he owed, the deals he was trying to salvage before everything collapsed. Piece by piece, she built a map of Frank's ruin. It wasn't enough to watch him fall. She wanted to orchestrate it. She wanted to pull the strings herself. Shirley noticed the change. Of course she did. Shirley always had a way of seeing the truth beneath Susan's calm surface. "Revenge won't bring your legs back," Shirley said one night, standing in the doorway of Susan's apartment, arms crossed tight over her chest. Susan looked at her, eyes cold and unblinking. "I know." "Then why?" Shirley's voice cracked, raw with worry. Susan's gaze never wavered. "Because it'll bring me back." Shirley's shoulders sagged like all the air had been knocked out of her. But she didn't argue. She knew it was too late for that. The final move came sooner than expected. Raymond handed her a small black notebook. Frank's ledger of debts and betrayals, stolen from under his nose. It was a goldmine of destruction. Every crooked deal, and every dirty name scrawled in Frank's messy handwriting. Susan flipped through it, her pulse quickening with every page. "This will finish him," Raymond said, his eyes gleaming like a man who had waited too long for justice. Susan closed the notebook, her decision sharp and final. "No," she said. Raymond frowned. "No, finishing him would be too merciful." Susan replied, her voice like ice slicing through the air. "I want him to rot, slowly, to watch everything he built crumble piece by piece, until there's nothing left." For the first time, Raymond looked at her with something close to respect, maybe even fear. "You've changed," he said quietly. Susan's lips twisted into a bitter curve. "No," she whispered. "I've become who I was always meant to be." As she turned away, slipping the notebook into her coat, she felt the weight of her old self fall away completely. Frank didn't know it yet, but his final reckoning had already begun. And Susan, she wasn't coming to him for closure. She was coming to bury him alive in the ruins of his own making. Frank had run out of places to hide. Susan knew it, the moment she saw him step out of that grim warehouse, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow. His steps were quick but clumsy, like a man stumbling through a nightmare, praying to wake up, but knowing deep down this was real. His world wasn't just cracking anymore. It was collapsing beneath his feet. She followed him, silent and unseen, as he moved through the back streets of the city like a hunted animal. The power he used to wear like armor was gone, stripped away piece by miserable piece. His phone calls grew more frantic. His breath came faster, and still he never once thought to look behind him. Maybe a part of him still believed she was gone. Maybe he thought she died on that cold street, left to rot while he stepped over her broken body and walked away. He'd be wrong, so painfully wrong. Raymond met her at the usual spot, a slight smirk playing at his lips as he dropped a worn key onto the table between them. "Storage unit," he said, "out by the docks. It's his last stash of cash, weapons, maybe even a few desperate favors. He's planning to bolt before dawn." Susan stared at the key like it was a spark, the final piece to set the whole thing ablaze. "Not before I get there," she said quietly. Raymond tilted his head, studying her. "What then? You going to face him?" She didn't answer right away. Instead she slipped the key into her pocket and pushed away from the table. She didn't need to answer. Raymond already knew. Susan's mind wasn't filled with hesitation anymore. No doubts, no fear, only focus. She had built this moment from the ground up, brick by bitter brick. She would not let it slip through her fingers now. The docks were quiet when she arrived, the air heavy with the smell of salt and rust. Her prosthetics clicked softly beneath her coat as she walked the length of the weathered warehouse, her heart cold but steady. She could feel it, the end creeping closer. Inside the storage unit, Frank's silhouette moved fast and panicked, tossing duffel bags onto the floor, rifling through piles of old cash and weapons like they were lifelines. His hair was longer now, disheveled, streaked with gray. His hands, once steady and commanding, shook like brittle leaves in the wind. Susan watched from the shadows for a long moment, letting the image burn into her mind. This was the man she had nearly died for. This was the man who had looked at her broken body and seen only inconvenience. And here he was, broken himself. Her breath was ice in her chest as she stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Frank froze, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Their eyes met. It hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. She saw it, the flicker of disbelief, the flash of guilt, of fear, of something uglier still. His mouth opened but no words came out. Susan didn't give him the chance. "You thought I was dead," she said, her voice razor sharp. Frank swallowed hard, his face draining of color. "Susan, the sound of her name in his mouth almost made her laugh. Almost. But there was no laughter left in her. "You left me there," she continued, her tone flat but burning beneath the surface. "You didn't even look back. I thought you." He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. He couldn't lie. Not now. Not when the truth stared him dead in the face. Susan took another step closer. The smell of fear was thick in the air, clinging to him like sweat. He backed away instinctively, bumping into one of the shelves with a hollow clang. "I saved your life," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I gave up everything for you, and you left me to die." Frank's chest heaved, his breath ragged. "I didn't know what to do," he said weakly. "You ran," she corrected him coldly. "You did what you always do." Silence settled between them, heavy as stone. Frank's eyes flicked toward the exit, calculating. He still thought he could run. Susan saw it before he moved. "Don't," she warned, her voice low and deadly. "You'll never outrun me." For a brief second, Frank's bravado flickered. "What do you want?" he asked, desperation creeping into his words. Susan stepped forward, until she was close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. She could have reached out and touched him. She could have ended it all right there. But she didn't. "I want you to live," she whispered, her eyes like ice. "Live knowing you lost everything.
Live knowing you made me like this. She let the words sink in, let them choke him as surely as if she had wrapped her hands around his throat. And then without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him frozen in his own failure, trapped in a cage of fear and regret that no amount of money or power could unlock. She didn't need to kill him. She had already buried him alive. Susan stepped out of the storage unit and felt the cold wind slap her face like a final brutal goodbye to the past. Behind her, Frank stayed frozen in place, caged not by walls, but by the wreckage of his own choices. She didn't need to look back to know it. She felt it in her bones, in the heavy silence that followed her steps. The sky above the docks had begun to fade from bruised purple to gray as dawn crept over the horizon. Light always came, but for Frank, Susan knew there would be no dawn, only endless night. Raymond was waiting by his car, leaning against the hood like a man who had seen this kind of ending 100 times before. His expression was unreadable, though a flicker of something, maybe admiration, maybe caution, crossed his face when their eyes met. "Well?" he asked. Susan didn't answer right away. She brushed past him, opened the car door, and slid into the passenger seat like it was any other day. Like she hadn't just faced the ghost who'd nearly destroyed her life.
Only after Raymond started the engine did she speak, her voice quiet but unbreakable. "He's finished." Raymond let out a low breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Thought you'd kill him," he said, pulling away from the docks. "So did he," Susan replied. They drove in silence for a while, the city waking up around them, unaware of the quiet war that had just ended in the shadows. Susan's thoughts weren't on Frank anymore. Not really. She had buried him in that storage unit, and she wouldn't waste her life digging him up again. But something else lingered in her chest, something colder than victory, sharper than revenge. Emptiness. She had chased this moment for so long, built her every breath around it, and now that it was done, she felt the quiet weight of it settling over her shoulders. Raymond must have seen it in her eyes because he spoke without taking his gaze off the road. "You think it'll feel better tomorrow?" Susan's lips curved into a bitter, knowing smile. No, at least she was honest. She thought of Shirley then, her friend's tired eyes filled with worry, filled with fear that Susan would lose herself completely in this storm of vengeance. Maybe she already had. Maybe there was no going back. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to go back at all. The future wasn't behind her, in the ruins of Frank's empty promises. It was somewhere else, unwritten, unknown. Raymond pulled up outside her apartment and killed the engine. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her for a long moment like he was memorizing her face, like he wasn't sure if he'd ever see her again. "I never figured you for the quiet ending type," he said finally. Susan met his gaze, her eyes steady. "It's not the end." Raymond's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No," he agreed. "No, it's not." She stepped out of the car and shut the door behind her with finality. Raymond didn't drive away right away. He stayed parked there watching her as she climbed the steps to her building. Her steps measured, unhurried. Inside, the apartment felt colder than usual. Quieter too. Susan stood in the center of the room, looking at the life she had built after the wreckage. Sparse, but hers. Honest. Every piece of it carved out of her own survival. On the windowsill sat a photograph she hadn't bothered to burn. A picture of her and Shirley, arms around each other laughing like the world hadn't yet found ways to hurt them. She picked it up, tracing her finger over Shirley's face. Frank's shadow no longer clouded her vision. Maybe now, she could start to see the people who had stayed. Maybe she could start to see herself. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back. A message from Shirley lit up the screen. "Are you okay?" Susan stared at the words, her throat tight. She thought of all the ways she could answer. She thought of all the lies she could tell, but instead she typed back slowly, deliberately. "I don't know, but I think I will be." She set the phone down and stood by the window, watching the first light of day stretch across the skyline. Frank was over. His chapter in her story was closed for good. What came next was hers to write. And this time she would write it for herself. Morning sunlight touched Susan's face like a quiet stranger, soft but unfamiliar. She stood there by the window, her eyes tracing the streets below, the world moving on as if none of it had happened. Frank's ruin, her survival, all of it swallowed by the everyday noise of life. She wondered if anyone could sense it. The war that had ended just hours before, the ghost she had finally buried. No one would know, no one needed to. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was liberating. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Not loud, not urgent, familiar. She opened it to find Shirley standing there, her eyes tired but full of a stubborn warmth that Susan hadn't known she missed until now. Shirley didn't speak at first. She just stepped inside, took one look at Susan's face, and pulled her into a hug. Susan stiffened, her body still wired for battle, but after a moment, she let herself sink into it. Not fully, not yet, but enough. "You're here," Susan said quietly, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Of course I'm here," Shirley replied, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "You think I was going to let you do this alone?" They sat together at the small kitchen table, the sun slowly filling the room with warmth that felt almost foreign after so much cold. Shirley's hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her fingers fidgeting like she wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. Finally she spoke. "Did you see him?" Susan's eyes drifted toward the window. "I saw him. And he's already gone, Shirley. Just doesn't know it yet." Shirley let out a shaky breath, part relief, part sorrow. "And you?" Susan didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars on her skin, at the life carved from pain and stubbornness. She thought about Frank's face when he saw her, the moment the truth sank in. She thought about the weight of it lifting from her chest as she turned her back on him once and for all. "I'm not broken anymore," she said at last. "Not by him." Shirley's eyes glistened with quiet pride. "Good," she whispered. "Good." The words sat heavy between them, not in a bad way, but in the way truths often do when they're finally spoken out loud. Later when Shirley left, Susan stayed at the table, watching the light creep across the floor. Her phone vibrated once. A message from Raymond. "He's running east, probably won't make it far. Do you want to finish it?" Susan's lips curled into something sharp, almost a smile but not quite. She let her fingers hover over the screen, thinking about all the ways she could answer. End it completely. Raymond had said, finish him. But no, she didn't need to chase ghosts anymore. She didn't need to crush what was already dust. Her reply was simple. No, let him run. I'm done with him. She turned off the phone and set it aside, her eyes rising to meet her own reflection in the window. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't see the woman Frank had broken. She didn't see the victim. She saw herself. Whole, scarred, yes, but scars were proof of survival. Susan stood, crossing the room to the small desk in the corner where she'd kept her old journals, the ones she hadn't dared open since before the accident. She pulled one free, its leather cover worn but still strong, and opened to the first blank page. The pen felt heavy in her hand, at first then natural, like it belonged there. She started to write, not about Frank, not about revenge, but about what came next, about herself, about the life she would build, piece by piece, not from love, not from loss, but from her own fierce, unbreakable will. The past was finished. Frank would vanish into the shadows of his own destruction, and Raymond would return to his games, always looking for the next weak man to crush. But Susan, she would live, not in fear, not in bitterness, in freedom. The pen scratched across the paper as she wrote the words that would become her truth, her final act of defiance against the man who once made her believe she wasn't enough. I was never his to break. And now she was finally free.